Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kate and today we are going to talk about books. So a lot of you have asked me about the books that I'm reading for my master's, whether I could recommend books that I'm reading as a part of my master's degree. And yes, absolutely I can. I have picked out some absolutely wonderful books here that I feel have enhanced my understanding of interdisciplinary studies, particularly within my master's. So we have a variety of history, art history, philosophy, literature books here that I rely on consistently for my master's, and which I think if you are considering interdisciplinary studies or whether you are just studying a single subject area like English literature, that these books really enhance your understanding or enhance your approach to analysis within humanities. I am a big advocate for interdisciplinary studies. That's why I am doing an interdisciplinary master's. And some of these were recommended to me when I started the master's. Others I've kind of picked up at my own pace, but let's dive into it. There are a whole lot of books here. These are not the books that I will be discussing. Those I am reading as a part of my upcoming residency at Oxford. So if you want to keep a lookout for that video, that will be coming when I go to Oxford. So definitely subscribe to my channel and keep a lookout because it's going to be a lot of fun. All right, enough chit chat. Let's get into it. So, as I said, I've divided the books into areas. So I've got history, art history, material culture, philosophy, classics-esque kind of situation, and then literature specifically as well. So I'm going to start with history because I think it's the biggest pile and probably the one that's going to stretch across multiple disciplines like literature, like art, all of those kind of things. So the first book that I'm going to recommend here is Keith Jenkins' Rethinking History. This book is absolutely foundational if you are going to do anything around history, historical context, historiography. This little book, it's really, really small, is jam-packed with a methodology of looking at historical context in a very enlightening way. I think Jenkins wrote it a couple of years ago. First published in 1991, and I still think this is so prevalent to how we look at history, how we look at anything really. I mean, you could look at a piece of literature, and if you don't consider its historical context, I think you're missing a big piece of the puzzle there. So this is absolutely foundational in my eyes. I would highly recommend reading this. It's really small. As I said, you can probably pick it up from like your local library or your university library. I just feel that it really brought into light the way that I wanted to think about history when I was conducting my studies, my research, my analysis. So that is the first one and possibly the most pivotal one. The next one that I wanted to flag up and wanted to promote, this is Susan Brigden's New Worlds, Lost Worlds, the Rule of the Tudors from 1485 to 1603. And if you are studying anything early modern period, which is my area of interest, I would highly recommend picking this up. As I say, it's a really good overview of the Tudor reign and the Tudor period, which gives you that great historical context. And there are plenty of other similar books for other areas of research. I obviously just focus on this area because this is the time period of my research, the early modern sort of Tudor reign. But the reason that I picked this up as opposed to some of the other very comprehensive overviews is her inclusion of the effects that the Tudor rule has on Ireland. And as you know, like I'm branching my area of research into the effects of England on Ireland during this period. And so there is a lot in here that goes back to how it affected Ireland at the time and includes a lot of historical context about Ireland at the time. So I really, really like this book. It's a really good read. It's really understandable. Does it lack detail in some parts? Yes, but it has a very, very comprehensive bibliography that you could always dive into further if you wanted to go into more in-depth research there. The next book that I want to recommend is Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic. This is the foundation of my master's proposal. I read this book during my undergrad certificate, and I just was blown away by this book. Not only because of the research that Gilroy does in identifying the diaspora and the basis of what that does for identity and psychology, but I think this is also a fantastic example of interdisciplinary research that has come out. I think this was first published in 1991, I believe, 1993. I think Gilroy's book is such an epic example of an interdisciplinary study that has been done on a gap that existed. And as an example of research, I don't think you can get better than Gilroy. The way that he has conducted his methodology, which is very historical, but also incredibly psychological, and draws on areas of anthropology and literature. I just think it's absolutely fantastic to read as an example of an interdisciplinary study, and also as an example of how good research is done in the gaps. Again, another historical book that I am absolutely reliant on, but this is more focused on my area of interest. This is Black Tudors by Miranda Kaufmann. This book is so fantastic in looking at case studies of individuals in historical contexts, and particularly Black individuals in the Tudor era. And I really love this book. I love this book as an example of how history can come together to form a picture, especially when it comes to people in history that we maybe have neglected in the past. And this is just truly, truly fantastic. I love this book. I think it's really, really fabulous. And if you are studying literature, if you are studying history, even if you're studying art, this is absolutely fantastic to look at for that historical period. Another book that I actually just thought about, and I have it downstairs, but I haven't brought it up here, is Edward Said's Orientalism. Now, if you have done any sort of humanities course, you will know about Said and you will know about his influential work, Orientalism. Is it something that is still very, very prevalent today? i.e., is it something that we would still study and still look at, and is it still a valid theorem? I think to some extent it is, even though there is a lot of work that is being done on dissecting Said's original arguments. I think it is such an important foundation for discovering research like Paul Gilroy, like Miranda Kaufmann, the way that they identify those themes, I suppose, of going against the grain of what we have been shown in history in the past. So it's not really a historical book. It wouldn't really fall under history per se. I think it would be more of a theory-based book around Orientalism and the view of the exotic, particularly in situations of like first encounters and slavery and colonization. So I do think it is something to read as a humanities or an interdisciplinary student. It is a rather dense text, I will just warn you, but also to that effect, there is a lot in the theory side of humanities that you can get into, and I will leave a link of this textbook that I read in my undergrad certificate. I didn't read the whole thing, obviously, but it includes a lot of influential essays across different areas of theories like Orientalism or feminism, and exploring writers such as Judith Butler and things like that, which I think if you are starting out in these areas, it's absolutely fundamental to understand those basic theories and where they come from and why they are still so influential today. Moving on to some of the literature books that I have here, I've actually only pulled out 3, and I've pulled out 3 for very particular reasons. You would have heard me speak about these books. If you've been on this channel before, you would have heard me speak about these books before, so this might be boring. You might want to skip ahead to the next section, but nevertheless. So the first one that I want to speak about is Desire by Jonathan Dollimore. I read this last year. It was my non-fiction pick for last year, and I still think about this book today. I just think it is such a fantastic, nuanced approach to literature, because yes, it is a memoir and it is very personal reflections of Dollimore's view, particularly when it comes to sexuality. But I think what is so interesting in this is his adaptation of traditional study to his philosophy of life. And in that way, I think something like this should be mandatory reading on a reading list, because even though the content itself might not be the area that people are studying, the way that he approaches this, I think, is the real winner for this book. The fact that he goes through his own memories, his recollection of struggles with depression, with his sexuality, with understanding what it means to have a varied sexuality, particularly during the times of the AIDS crisis. And the way he attributes it to literature that he studied or theorems that he studied and challenges them in a particular way is something that I don't think I've seen any other book do. So yes, 120% to this book. Not only is it a fantastic read and you'll have a great time reading it, but I think understanding the way that he's done it is really fantastic. And to that effect, I'm a big advocate of looking at things in a different light, reinterpreting things in a different light. And I can honestly say that this book, The Vagabond Spirit of Poetry by Edward Clarke, is probably the reason for that. So a little plug here, Edward Clarke was one of my professors in my undergrad certificate, and I was blown away by his lectures. But when I found out that he'd written this book, he never promoted it himself, by the way, which I think a lot of professors love to do, is promote their own work, especially on their reading list. He never promoted this work himself. But when I got hold of it, I just thought it was a really fantastic way of re-looking at literature, poetry, at understanding the feeling behind it, rather than just the methodology. What Clarke is purporting here, or what he is proposing in this book, is that the idea of poetry and the idea of sanctimonious feeling that goes into poetry is something that is really lost on a reader who is just reading poetry in a methodological fashion. So think of the Dead Poets Society, when Robin Williams tears or tells the students to tear up the way that they should study poetry by rhyme and meter, and that's what determines good poetry.
Rip out the entire page. Come on, rip it out. Thank you, Mr. Dalton. Gentlemen, tell you what, I'll just tear out that page, tear out the entire introduction.
This is kind of that in a more academic fashion, right? Because what he does is he goes through particular poets and particular poems and reanalyzes them, reassesses them in understanding the spirit behind those poems, behind the poem and the poet. It's him or herself. And I just think it is a really, really fantastic book if you are studying literature to have a look at, to maybe give you a little bit of a different perspective on interpretation that is divergent from what we are currently taught in institutions these days. I've harped on about this book so much recently. I'm sorry, I'm not sorry, because Eve Bites Back by Anna Baer is honestly the most phenomenal feminist view of literature that I have read in an insanely long time. What Baer does in this book is she basically takes female authors from particular eras, pulls them into the spotlight, explores their historical context, particularly as it pertains to their authorship, and why they did or didn't publish their writing in their lifetime. And she really focuses on the authorship side of it, but I think she touches on something more, which is this idea of how female writers in particular time frames really molded themselves on themselves, because there was very little in the way of female authorship at the time on which to guide their direction of writing. And what I love about the way that she explores this book is that it can be read by anyone. You don't have to be academic to appreciate the way that she writes this book, because not only is her tone really accessible to anyone who wants to read it, but she's also really clever at dropping little bits for, I suppose, the academic reader who might say, oh, I want to explore that a bit more, because there are so many things in here that I flagged up and I put on like my essay sheet where I was like, this could be explored more, this could be explored more. Obviously, she's only got a finite number of pages to address in this book, and she does, as I say, focus on the idea of female authorship, which is brilliant in and of itself. But there is something really profound in the way that she tackled this project, the authors that she chose, the female authors that she chose. Julian of Norwich, Marjorie Kemp, Amelia Lanya. Oh my gosh, Amelia Lanya was like a new discovery for me. I cannot wait to research her more. Anne Bradshaw, Aphra who I love. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who I'm currently studying. Her book is somewhere in this pile of her letters are somewhere in this pile of what I'm currently studying. Jane Austen and Mary Elizabeth Brandon. And I loved this book. I loved everything about this book. I breezed through it in a weekend. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. And I think every literature student should read this book. Okay, so those are the literature books. I think what I will just start off with is the one philosophy book that I will flag up here. And admittedly, I haven't read this. But one of the girls in Accepted Society, Christy, I will leave her channel down below. She's absolutely fantastic. She is studying Gothic literature, and she has been doing a lot of philosophy research as a part of her PhD. And she recommended this in our Accepted Society book club for the last 2 weeks while she was reading this. And I'll just read the blurb, but basically this book will introduce you to philosophical thought in a very nuanced approach, and an approach hopefully that will stick, rather than reading a whole lot of philosophers that are very abstract and very difficult to understand. I do feel like I want to promote this book because it's these kind of nuanced approaches, like Sophie's World, like Desire by Jonathan Dollimore, like The Black Atlantic by Paul Gilroy, that make the biggest impressions because they are so divergent and so different from the stock standard books that we would be reading as academics. And I do apologize if you can hear my dog snoring in the background. Apparently I am boring him. But I'll just read this. This is, by the way, this is Sophie's World by Jostein Gaarder. And looking in her mailbox one morning, a 14-year-old Norwegian schoolgirl called Sophie Munsten finds a surprising piece of paper. On it are written 2 questions. Who are you, and where did the world come from? The writer is an enigmatic philosopher called Albert Knox, and his 2 teasing questions are the beginning of an extraordinary tour through the history of Western philosophy from the pre-Socrates to Sartre. And in a series of brilliant, entertaining letters, and then in person with his dog, Hermes, love, Albert Knox opens Sophie's inquiring mind to the fundamental questions that philosophers have been asking since the dawn of civilization. I think this is a really great sort of a fun way of approaching philosophy, particularly if it's not something that you have ever studied before. And I am desperate to read this book. I have read a few pages of it when it arrived. This came from my secondhand bookstore. It was in my secondhand bookstore, so I was so excited. I cannot wait to dive into this more. The next couple of books that I have are all sourced from my secondhand bookstore, which I think are pretty cool, actually. The next book that I want to flag up is just an illustration book of, if you are studying in a particular area like history or art or literature, you do need to have an understanding of the classic mythology, some of the classics, because a lot of these resurface themselves in the study of literature or of history, and especially in art. So I just wanted to flag up, this is something that I picked up recently from my secondhand bookstore. This is the Celtic Myths and Legends that I'm starting to explore a bit more as it sort of pertains to my history. But something that I'll also flag up here that I left downstairs, but I did want to talk about, is this dictionary of symbols. I am so thrilled that I purchased this book when I did, because I have used it so often when I am interpreting literature, when I'm interpreting things in art. I have found that having this dictionary of symbols is so helpful. It is exactly what it says on the tin. It is a dictionary of symbols, but they also divide up certain interpretations based on the time period that those interpretations were prevalent, or the geographical setting of those interpretations, which really adds such a fascinating dynamic to the analysis. So just flagging that up here for you to check out. I think this is an invaluable manual when you are interpreting pieces of literature, poetry, art, all those kind of things. So even history, if you're looking at like accounts between traders, those kind of things, it can definitely show certain value to trade items and things like that. Speaking of which, this is A History of the World in 100 Objects by Neil MacGregor. I have just dipped in and out of this book. Again, it's something I picked up from my secondhand bookstore. It's got a little bit of water damage, but it is still absolutely readable. And I think something like this for studying things like material culture is really, really fascinating for understanding that interdisciplinary approach that I've been talking about. So by looking at objects in here, like the Parthenon, for instance, and understanding parts of the archaeology or parts of the material culture when it comes to, pottery or gold chains and jewelry, plates, those kind of things, scrolls even. I think something like this book is really, really fundamental, not only in looking at those particular objects itself, but also understanding the methodology that is adopted in looking at those objects, because it's not just looking at them in a historical context, it's looking at them in a variety of contexts. And I think that is why this book is really, really fantastic when you are looking at things like material culture. Again, it doesn't necessarily have to just be in material culture, but you could be looking at a plate, for instance, or a dress in a painting, or a particular piece of clothing that is described in a book or a piece of literature. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, for instance, describes in acute detail the Turkish dress that she wears in comparison to the English dress of the 18th century. And something like that, if you can visualize it and you can see the differences, that is something that is truly, truly unique and really fundamental, I think, in this area of study. Speaking of material culture, we are about to hit into the art and art history side of things, and something that's kind of on the border of material culture and art history is this absolutely brilliant gem of a book. This is The Ways of Seeing by John Berger. This book is truly, truly phenomenal. I breezed through this book when I started reading it. The way that it discusses the way that we view things like art and advertisements and things like that. But I think it's also important in the way that we view whatever we are studying, coming to a piece of text or a piece of literature, a piece of historical text in an archive, by exploring what kind of views we are coming to that text with ahead of actually understanding that text. This is something that is so, so fundamental, I think, for any humanities student. So actually for any student, even if you are in the STEM world, I think just understanding and questioning what our preconceived ideas are before we come to analyzing something is so brilliant and so fundamental. So Ways of Seeing is definitely something that I think we should all read. The other book which I have spoken about on end, people are going to be so sick of me speaking about this book, but this is Woman in the Picture by Catherine McCormack. I have used this book in my own research. I continue to use it in my research because it is kind of based off of the methodology that John Berger uses. Catherine McCormack actually references John Berger in this book and in the methodology that she adopts for re-examining pictures of female subjects. And I just think the way that she does this, the methodology that she adopts in this, and identifying those key themes that actually come up quite frequently in Eve Bites Back as well, are really ideal and very, very cleverly done. The way that McCormack also brings in not only historical context in her analysis, but the pieces of literature that might relate to the subject matter. So when she talks about Venus, for instance, she brings in the mythological side of Venus and where that might have come from and that historical context that comes from. And that interdisciplinary approach in studying, well, she's studying art history, but I think it's something that is applicable across the disciplines. So Woman in the Picture, even if you're not an art fan, this will make you an art fan. That's it. I'm tired now. No, I love discussing books. If you guys have any book recommendations for me, non-fiction books, fiction books, anything like that, please pop them in the comments down below. We have just hit the right timing because the sun is starting to blare in here and I am going to look absolutely awful. Look at that. Look at the sun. She is coming. She is rising. So, thank you everyone for being here. If you are still here after all of my rambles about books, thank you for being here. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please do support me, do like, comment, subscribe, all of the good things as I continue on with my master's and academic journey. And thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.